ask you a question, Lyn. So when you introduce yourself to people, how do you identify yourself when you introduce yourself?
I mean, that's a good question, because a lot of, over time, people have these different tribes that they connect with. It could be a nation, it could be a religion. In older days, it was literally a tribe. That's where we get the term from. And so now now we have these online tribes, right? So I might identify as profession. That's actually another big thing with the past, especially the last century. We've identified as a profession.
Well, that's where our last names came from primarily, right? It was our profession.
Exactly. Yeah. And mine was a region. My name came from a region.
Yep.
And so everyone, basically either regions or professions often were how names came about. And so now I guess, basically my investments, my profession, and just me as a person, rather than tied to any one thing. I still naturally identify with certain countries more than others, and I think many people still do. But certainly we in many cases view ourselves as world citizens. We have friends around the world. We interact around the world. And so how would you say that this kind of impacts money? Now that we can transfer value anywhere, now that we're less tethered to a specific profession, a specific region, what does that mean for money going forward?
So I think this is actually one of the most powerful things that we don't talk about often enough, is the impact that money has on identity, right? Typically, when you identify yourself, even when I was a kid growing up, right? I grew up in the Netherlands in the time before the European Union. So I recall, we'd go on summer holidays and we'd drive our little camper van to the south of France, and you'd hang out with other kids. And the first thing you would tell people is like, this is where I'm from. Now I never talk about where I'm from. People don't ask me. Nobody talks about religion anymore, right? Religion doesn't really define us in our social life. So your passport no longer defines your identity. Your religion, for many people, no longer defines your identity. In fact, 40% of America's population identifies as spiritual but not religious. It's the biggest religious movement that's happened in centuries, and it doesn't yet have a name, but it's certainly emerging. And the Harvard School of Theology is doing a lot of really interesting groundbreaking work on this, which I think is kind of interesting. We can get into Bitcoin as a religion later, because I think it's pretty fascinating. But most people identify as spiritual but not religious, so religion is not really a core identifying characteristic. They don't identify based on their profession. They identify based on their beliefs, their principles, and the online communities, for a large part, in which they spend time. And so what starts to become really interesting is the concept of money in that construct. So historically, the place in which I'm physically located and the passport I hold dictates what currency I use. If I have the misfortune of being born in Iran, right, by no fault of my own, I have no access to the global financial system because of sanctions. And sanctions and financial violence are the most prevalent form of violence in our world today. It's no longer physical, it's the violence of exclusion. I no longer have the ability to travel by nature of my physical passport, but I have an internet connection, and I can plug into, I don't want to call it the metaverse since that term's been corrupted, but I can plug into this global community. And all of a sudden, right, we live in this like vibrant new world where people no longer work for corporations. People no longer have government issued identities. You're known by your handle. You're known by your avatar or your PFP, your profile picture. And we can get into the identity that people are assigning themselves through these PFPs that are becoming assets in and of themselves. And I identify based on the communities in which I interact online. In fact, I spend a lot of time talking to people on the internet whose identities I don't know, who I've never interacted with in real life. I know nothing about them other than how they present themselves online in these digital communities. And what starts to become really fascinating is these online communities have now been imbued with capital. And there are multi-billion-dollar, and in the case of Bitcoin and Ethereum, multi-trillion-dollar economies that are emerging online around these communities that exist only in cyberspace, that exist only in this sort of esoteric form of self-identification. And what's really interesting is in this new world, individuals are more powerful than institutions, right? And institutions don't look the same as they did in our old world, in the meat space world, because all of a sudden we no longer require physical proximity to enable social coordination. And I think fundamentally what's happened here that I think very few nation states have grasped is this long-held tension between voice or exit, right? Historically, our ability to exit has been limited because the money has always been the limiting factor. There's no way for me, if I'm dissatisfied with what's happening in this country, to exit the US dollar. There wasn't until 2010. And now all of a sudden, people have the ability to exit, and trillions of dollars of value is choosing to exit the system and flow into a new system, one that's built on an entirely different set of technologies, but more importantly, an entirely different set of ideological principles, an entirely different set of sort of identity constructs that are still being developed, but are so fundamentally different from what we've seen over the past 4 centuries. And I think, again, it's that philosophical element that's so interesting to me. Like, as a worldwide population, I think there's a massive crisis in sort of global identity and how we identify ourselves. And it's been really interesting to see like the emergence of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a personality for some people. It becomes a core part of their identity. Do you consider Bitcoin to be a part of your identity?
I don't know about identity, but it's certainly about what, I guess a thing that gives me passion. Like if I look at my investments, if I look at a specific company, I might not, really be tied to whether that company succeeds or not, other than a financial interest. Where there's, there are a handful of things, and Bitcoin is certainly probably the key one, where I actually wanted to succeed more so than just my own financial gain from that. Mm-hmm. And I see on Twitter, for example, you'll see people put like .hodl or .eth in their handles to kind of express either what tribe they're in or what's important to them right off the bat.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly become a big theme, and even some of the detractors of the space have compared it to religion. While as people within the space took that and ran with it. And also, religion's about network effects. And so we have these kind of spreading of ideas, and then also with spreading of ideas comes spreading of resources and in some ways concentration of resources.
So I want to kind of put an analogy in here. At first, we had cathedrals, right? And cathedrals were great monuments of their age. Then we had skyscrapers, right? And if you look at a city skyline, what defines a city skyline? It's these physical structures, these towers constructed by corporations. They're sort of the monoliths of capitalism. And what I like in Bitcoin, too, is like Bitcoin is a digital cathedral. Right? It is like this shining beacon. It's using, and what's really cool about both cathedrals and skyscrapers is they employ like mind-bending new technology. People sought to build things that had never been built before that people would look at and just be awestruck by. And I think for many of us, Bitcoin is the digital instantiation of that for a group of people who increasingly spend most of their time online, tethered to supercomputers in their pockets. The other thing I think is interesting is our generation is likely the last generation that grew up without the internet, right? I got the internet as a teenager, and it's been a part of my late sort of teenage years, but I didn't have an iPhone in my pocket growing up. We're the last generation to experience that. And this new generation, like they're digitally native. They're growing up omnipresent online, which I think also has profound implications for people's preferences, for the way they shape their identity, and for the way they interact with money and value.
Going back to the idea of like a digital object or a digital asset having real value that we're willing to give resources for is something that some investors have been very challenging to get their head around. But for younger investors, it's often very intuitive. Starting, especially from our ages and younger, there are certainly items in digital, in video games that we care about, that we're willing to put, resources into in order to dress our character up or empower our character in some way.
Mine was Final Fantasy VII, breeding the golden chocobo. That was like a month of my summer as a child. And I spent a lot of time and energy. That's actually how I got on the internet. I was hanging out on all sorts of weird forums, figuring out like the right combination of nuts to feed my chocobo so I could breed the perfect golden chocobo to get me the spell that would let me defeat like the level boss at the end.
And so it's not surprising that people in this age group, when they see the creation of digital scarcity, basically the invention of something that enables us to have objects like that, not just within that video game, but then transfer between video games and basically just be this worldwide asset that is an open network. And so in that world, we've what we view as money is always, when in hindsight, kind of arbitrary. So it's like, how can people put value in digital bits of information? Well, we can ask the same question about pieces of paper that we trade ourselves with, without being like joking. Like, well, I'll give you pieces of paper, you'll give me something. And yet this is a relatively new conception.